Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit more about why flow matters. Um, Specifically about why I was curious to learn about flow and what it could mean for you. So I had heard a little bit about flow, and then I watched a podcast, Joe Rogan podcast, with Faraz Zahabi, the coach of George St. Pierre, who is an um, MMA fighter, one of the all-time greats, and he was talking about how Faraz was talking about how when he trains jiu-jitsu, he trains at a level of difficulty such that he gets into a flow state and such that the training becomes addictive. And I I heard that and I was very curious, thinking that flow might be a way to um, make your work more enjoyable. You can and possibly make your work addictive, make my work addictive and enjoyable. How and doing some light reading, I found that it was touted to give you more creativity, um, be more productive, and learn your skill faster. So that was why I was interested. And as I've read the books and listened to the talks, I have realized that if you can, if you know what the flow triggers are, um, meaning if you know what circumstances get you into flow, then I thought to maybe I could use those to improve um, my work environment, to get more out of my work, um, in terms of enjoyment and productivity. But in doing the reading, I saw that some of the triggers were one of the main triggers seemed to be high consequences. So if you're doing something where chances are you might be badly injured or die, there's a strong possibility of finding a flow state within that. Or or another example could be if you're doing something with high social consequences, like stand-up comedy, where you could face like social rejection. So in hearing that, I kind of thought, well, are there any flow triggers? It doesn't seem like I can use those flow triggers in my everyday work life. But then as I read on, I found that there are some that you can use, um, that they call internal flow triggers, and I'll go deeper into these in the next section. But briefly, I'll touch on three, and the first is the flow trigger of setting your challenge at the um, at the at the right level of difficulty. So by setting your current task, your current challenge, just outside of your current skill set, um, you 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 can create circumstances to trigger flow. Also, there is the internal trigger of setting clear goals. The emphasis being on clear, and I'll explain what that means more in the next section. Um, and then another trigger is you can put you can try and put mechanisms of feedback into your work. So um, instead of in business, usually there's a yearly report. You could do something like daily reports, and that constant checking and then going back to work and checking um, is a mechanism for keeping your attention in the present, and that's a flow trigger. And again, I'll go more into that in the next section. So I thought I could describe what Stephen does personally to create more flow around his working habits. So he does something called a flow hike, and he describes this in his talk at Google, where I'll go through what he does. So he wakes up at roughly 4 a.m. every morning, and works and writes from then until 8 a.m. At 8 a.m., he takes his dogs and goes on a hike. And this hike is designed to get him into a flow state. And when he's in that flow state, he'll begin to think about his work again, and then do another work session after the hike, feeling refreshed and possibly with new perspectives on any problems he might have been having. So at 8 a.m., he takes his dogs and he walks 20 to 25 minutes uphill very slowly. And he says in his talk that 20 to 25 minutes of exercise, low-grade exercise, low intensity, is a method for inducing transient hypofrontality, meaning that your prefrontal cortex goes quiet. Your that inner critic goes quiet. So he does that, and then he does roughly 5 minutes of hill sprints, of sprints uphill. He says that normal sprints on flat ground could work the same way, and he sprints for 5 minutes or until he starts to feel pain. And then what happens is his brain releases endorphins and anandamide, which are pain relievers, among other things. And then he runs down the hill, taking bigger steps than he usually would. And because he's taking risks, his brain releases dopamine, so that by the time he gets back on the path at the bottom of the hill, he has mimicked a flow state by shutting off the prefrontal cortex and getting some of these pleasurable neurochemicals. So he says he's usually in a low grade flow state by the time he gets down the hill, and in that state he starts to think about his work again. And I also want to touch on another idea he brings up, is that someone at the talk, someone asks him the question, I think someone asks him the question, or otherwise he basically explains that the more flow you create in your life, the more flow will permeate other areas of your life. So, and that's because of the nature of what flow is. Remember that flow is a focusing skill designed to put your attention in the present. So if you take up skiing or yoga or surfing, you learn in those skills, you learn to keep your attention in the present. And that skill of keeping your attention in the present translates to your work, to other things you do. So more flow in your life leads to more flow. Okay, now I'll touch on something that I think is important, and that is, what is the dark side of flow? So we've talked about how during flow your brain cocktails six neurochemicals, the most potent, the most pleasurable neurochemicals. And so what that means is that flow states and altered states are highly addictive. And what Csikszentmihalyi said was that unlike most addictions that actually take you backwards, flow states take you forwards, because flow only exists at the point where you are just stretching your current skill level. And what he said was that, and what Stephen and and Jamie say in their book is that what's difficult is that when people like rock stars, soldiers, extreme sports athletes, when they give up that life that has been so flow plentiful, then what's quite difficult is transitioning back to a normal life. It can be extremely difficult, and um, and and quite often um, ex rock stars or soldiers and even extreme sports athletes can fall into other other what's the word other addictive habits that other unhealthy addictive habits. So that is kind of the dark side of flow. Okay, so now I'd like to look at flow triggers. So flow triggers are circumstances, sometimes external, sometimes internal, that if they occur, you can produce more flow, or you will be thrust into a flow state. So these circumstances can be psychological circumstances, environmental circumstances, social circumstances, or creative circumstances. And I'll be looking at, I'll be looking at 3 that are internal flow triggers. So the first is the idea clear goals, and they emphasize that the priority here is clear. So let me give you an example. Say you are playing basketball and you have, I think it's called like, I don't know what it's called, but I'm going to use the word like you have a penalty shot to win the game. There was a foul on you and you can go for this shot to win the game. And if you're in that moment, if your goal is, I need to win the game, and then you take your shot, your focus is on the future. It's not on the immediate task in front of you. So chances are you won't be in flow. But if before you take that shot, your goal is, I will throw this ball such that, my goal is to throw this ball such that it goes through the hoop, then your focus is on the very next step, throwing the ball, not on the future outcome of winning the game. And so your focus is in the present. And they say that by articulating your goals in this way, focusing on what the very next step is for you in the path to eventually reaching those big goals that you have, if you can focus on the very next step and articulate that, then you will most likely be in flow, because your attention will be pushed to the present. They also say that if you articulate your goals, it means that while you're working or playing a game or doing an activity, if your mind ever wanders, it's like a beacon that your mind comes back to. Like, okay, this is what I'm doing. I'm trying to score a goal. And you should also articulate why you're doing that. So you're trying to score a goal because if you score a goal, then if you score more goals than the other team, then your team can win the football match. And it's a tricky business because you have to try and keep, you have to notice whether your attention is on the outcome or a bigger goal, or whether your attention is on the present, the immediate step in front of you. So that's the flow trigger of clear goals. The next flow trigger is the idea called immediate feedback. They say that if you are doing an activity where there is immediate feedback, it's likely that you will be in a flow state. So I think of the examples of being an actor on stage, where if you say one of your lines or are acting convincingly or say a funny line and you do it well, then the crowd laughs. If you do it badly, the crowd doesn't laugh, isn't engaged. So you're getting that immediate feedback from the crowd. If you are a surfer and you are surfing a wave and you stay on the wave and on the surfboard, well, your feedback is if you are doing it right, you stay on the board and stay on the wave, and if you're doing it wrong, you fall off. And if you are doing something like what's it like free diving, you have immediate feedback because if you lose your if you the feedback is whether you black out and drown or possibly drown, or whether you are still awake, and that is dependent on whatever factors are involved, like how well you're keeping your breath. And they say that if there isn't immediate feedback in your activity or task, then your attention starts to wander, and you look for clues as to whether you are doing your activity right or wrong. So, which is a very cool idea. So they say what you can do to get feedback into your activity, if it isn't inherently present like it is in surfing and skiing and maybe acting on stage, is that you can create feedback loops so that the time between output and input is smaller. So they say that in running a business, instead of having yearly reviews, you'd have daily reviews. So the whole idea is shortening these feedback loops so that you create mechanisms for knowing whether you're doing things right or wrong, rather than allowing your attention to wander whether you're doing and look for clues as to whether you're doing things right or wrong. And it's interesting because both these triggers, clear goals and immediate feedback, seem to be about ways of mindsets or habits that shift your attention that keep your attention in the present. And that's what flow is, as we've been learning. So the next trigger is the challenge and skills ratio. And this one we've touched on, where I said that flow only exists where you are stretching your skills, just where you are doing a challenge that's just above your current skill level. So I'll put a nice graph up now. And basically, if you're doing a task that you have done before, then you will be bored. But if you're doing a task that is significantly harder than what you've ever done, then you'll be anxious. And so what you want to be, they say, is in between anxiety and boredom, where the task is just outside your current, the challenge of the task is just outside your current skill level. And that is where you'll find flow. So that's something you can put into your working practice by maybe, or for a good example, an easy example is when you think of like, say you're learning to run long distance, you wouldn't start by running 10 miles. You might start by trying 1 mile or half a mile, and slowly you build that up. And they say that that's the same way to approach flow. And that's an interesting idea for me, because I've learned that the best way for me to pursue goals is to think, what's the next manageable step? What's the next step that's just harder than what I've done before? and yet still meaningful. And that seems to be a mix of the challenge and skills trigger and the clear goals trigger, thinking about what's the immediate next step. It's also how these two clear goals and the challenge and skills ratio is also how behavioral psychologists approach or help their patients get over fears. Is they break down that fear into smaller parts and allow you to, or encourage you to try and complete those parts one at a time. And as you get bored with the first level, then you go to the next level. An example could be that, say you're scared of going in an elevator, and I think Jordan Peterson uses this example in his lectures on maps of meaning, where he says that say that was your fear, you're scared of going in an elevator. A behavioral psychologist would break that down and say, okay, this week we're going to stand 20 meters away from an elevator, and you do that. And the first time you did that, you'd be a little bit scared, but it was okay. So then you'd say, okay, then next week we're going to stand 15 meters or maybe 10 meters. And you do that, and now you were a little bit more scared. So it took you longer to become settled at that point. And slowly you get closer until you were standing next to the elevator, and then maybe the next step would be running in the elevator and then coming out again until you slowly accomplish that skill. And I see that as being similar to the clear goals. What's the immediate next step, the small next step to get to the eventual big goal, and the challenge and skills ratio. What's the next step that's just outside of my current comfort zone? And another interesting thing about this challenge and skills ratio trigger is that it also serves to put your attention into the present, because if you do something that's just outside of your current skill level, that means you're going into some uncertainty. And when you go into uncertainty or take a risk, you get one thing that happens is your brain releases dopamine. So that feeling becomes addictive, that uncertainty. And another thing that happens is because you're going into uncertainty, you don't know what will happen next. So you start paying attention, close attention to the very next instant. And so your attention is again put into the present. And now I'm just going to mention some other flow triggers. I'm not going to go into them, but obviously if you're interested, you can do some research, and you can find this resource on the Flow Genome Project website. So here are the other triggers. Intensely focused attention. And I'll just tell you a little bit about some of them. Intensely focused attention, so that is getting rid of distractions. Multitasking doesn't help flow, it's detrimental. High consequences, so risk of injury or death or social rejection, it can induce flow. Rich environments, so nature. Deep embodiment, if you've practiced a skill for a long time, and also that skill involves physical movement. Okay, then I'm just going to mention the rest. So there's serious concentration. Here are some social triggers: shared goals, good communication, familiarity, equal participation, and skill level. Risk, like group risk, sense of control, close listening, always saying yes. This one, you can see this in play if you ever watch or participate in improv, in acting, where that's the rule of improv, is like always say yes, and and add to what's gone before you. And they say that that another trigger is creativity.